Elvis was very shy when I first met him. When I first met him,
was it Sun Studio? Where was it?
Sun Studio in Memphis there. Dewey Phillips was a disc jockey, and his brother Sam Phillips was on the station. So I used to go out to the studio. And
in 1969, B.B. King sat down for an interview that most people have never seen. And in that interview, he said something about Elvis Presley that should have changed the entire conversation around rock and roll, around race, around who gets to be called a legend, and who gets left in the footnotes of history. But it didn't, because the world wasn't ready to hear it. And for decades, that statement sat in archives and old recordings, largely ignored, occasionally referenced, but never truly reckoned with. Until now. Because something is happening. Slowly, quietly, but unmistakably. Fans are starting to go back. They're rewatching those old interviews. They're reading the quotes that got buried under decades of hero worship and carefully managed public relations. And they're realizing that what B.B. King said about Elvis Presley wasn't an attack. It wasn't bitterness. It wasn't jealousy. It was the truth. And the truth, as it turns out, is far more complicated, far more interesting, and far more important than the sanitized version of history we've been selling for over half a century. So let me be very clear about what this video is and what it is not. This is not a hit piece on Elvis Presley. This is not some modern attempt to tear down an icon because it's trendy or because we've decided that everyone from the past needs to be canceled. That's not what we're doing here. What we're doing is something far more necessary. We're telling the whole story. The one that includes the black musicians who created the sound that made Elvis Presley the biggest star on the planet. The one that includes the segregated radio stations and the record labels that wouldn't touch a black artist no matter how talented they were. The one that includes the impossible position Elvis found himself in, loving a kind of music that the system he benefited from had stolen, repackaged, and sold back to white America as something brand new. And here's the thing. You can love Elvis and still tell that story. You can honor what he did, the way he moved, the way he sang, the way he broke through barriers that no one had broken before, and still acknowledge that he walked through doors that had been opened by people who never got to walk through them themselves. That's not contradiction. That's history. That's complexity. That's the difference between mythology and truth. But for a long time, we didn't want complexity. We wanted the myth. We wanted the poor kid from Tupelo who rose from nothing and changed the world with his voice and his hips and his raw, untamed talent. And that story is true. But it's not the whole truth. Because the music that Elvis sang, the music that made him a legend, didn't come from nowhere. It came from somewhere very specific. It came from Beale Street in Memphis. It came from black churches and juke joints and the cotton fields of the Mississippi Delta. It came from men and women who had been playing that music, living that music, creating that music for decades, before a white kid from Tupelo ever stepped in front of a microphone. And one of those men was B.B. King. And B.B. King knew Elvis. He watched him rise. He saw what happened. And when he was asked about it, he didn't lie. He didn't sugarcoat it. He didn't pretend that everything was fair or that talent alone determined who got famous and who didn't. He told the truth. And the truth was this. Elvis didn't invent rock and roll. He didn't even claim to. But the world gave him credit for it anyway. Because he was white. Because the system was built that way. Because America in the 1950s wasn't ready to let a black man be the face of the music that was reshaping the entire culture. Now, if you're sitting there thinking you already know this, that you've heard this argument before, that this is just another tired conversation about cultural appropriation, I need you to stay with me. Because what B.B. King said goes deeper than that. It's not just about who sang what song first. It's not just about chart positions and record sales and who got rich and who didn't. It's about the relationship between two men who respected each other, who understood each other, and who were caught on opposite sides of a system that neither of them built, but both of them had to navigate. It's about the difference between theft and influence. It's about the space between admiration and exploitation. And it's about why, more than 70 years later, we're still arguing about it. Because here's what's changing. For decades, if you criticized Elvis, you were dismissed. You were told you didn't understand music. You were told you were being divisive. You were told that Elvis loved black music, that he gave credit where it was due, that he never pretended to be anything other than a student of the greats who came before him. And all of that is true. But it's also true that he became a billionaire icon while the people he learned from died broke. It's also true that white America embraced him in ways they never would have embraced Little Richard or Chuck Berry or Big Mama Thornton, no matter how talented they were. And it's also true that the story we tell about the birth of rock and roll has for far too long started with a white face and a white voice, when the truth is, it started long before Elvis ever walked into Sun Studio. And B.B. King knew that. He lived it. And what he said about Elvis, when you really listen to it, when you sit with it, when you let it challenge the version of history you've been taught, changes everything. Everything you thought you knew about the king. Elvis Presley was born in 1935 in Tupelo, Mississippi, in a two-room house that his father built with borrowed money. The family was poor. Not struggling poor. Desperately poor. The kind of poor where you wear the same clothes until they fall apart and you eat whatever someone will give you, and you grow up understanding that the world is not designed to make space for people like you. And that poverty, that outsider status, that feeling of being on the margins, it shaped everything about who Elvis became. Because when you grow up that poor, that invisible, you learn to watch, you learn to listen, you learn to absorb everything around you, because survival depends on paying attention. And what Elvis paid attention to, from the time he was old enough to understand what music was black music. Gospel music pouring out of the churches in the black neighborhoods where white kids weren't supposed to go, but where Elvis went anyway. Blues music drifting out of the juke joints on the wrong side of the tracks, where a white teenager had no business being, but where Elvis stood outside and listened because he couldn't help himself. Rhythm and blues and the raw, unfiltered sound of people who had turned suffering into something so powerful, so alive, that it didn't just move your body, it moved something deeper. And Elvis didn't just like that music. He didn't just appreciate it from a distance. He wanted to be inside of it. He wanted to sing it, feel it, live it. By the time he was a teenager, the Presley family had moved to Memphis, and Memphis in the late 1940s and early 1950s was the epicenter of something extraordinary. Beale Street was where black musicians gathered, where the sound was being born, where artists like B.B. King, Rufus Thomas, Howlin' Wolf, and dozens of others were creating a kind of music that had never existed before. It wasn't quite blues, it wasn't quite gospel, it wasn't quite country. It was all of it and none of it, and something entirely new. And Elvis, this skinny white kid with the greasy hair and the secondhand clothes, was there. Not performing, not on stage, just watching, listening, absorbing every note, every rhythm, every inflection, every move. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. He wasn't stealing, not consciously. He was learning. He was a student. And the men he was learning from, they saw him. Some of them even liked him. Because Elvis didn't pretend. He didn't walk into those spaces acting like he belonged or like he was doing anyone a favor by showing up. He came as someone who loved the music so much that he couldn't stay away. And that respect, that genuine love, it mattered. It's why B.B. King would later talk about Elvis not with anger, but with something closer to sadness. Because B.B. knew that Elvis wasn't the problem. The system was. And the system was this. In the 1950s, radio stations were segregated. There were white stations that played white music, and there were black stations that played what they called race records. And no matter how good the music was, no matter how talented the artist, if you were black, you could not get your music played on a white station. You could not get your face on the cover of a mainstream magazine. You could not perform in the venues that paid real money. The color of your skin determined the ceiling of your career, and that ceiling was low, and it was fixed, and there was no breaking through it. Not for Arthur Crudup, who wrote and recorded That's All Right, the song that became Elvis's first single. Not for Big Mama Thornton, who recorded Hound Dog 3 years before Elvis ever touched it and made it a hit that white America had never heard of. Not for any of the dozens of black artists who created the blueprint that Elvis followed. But Elvis could break through, because Elvis was white. And when Sam Phillips, the owner of Sun Records, famously said he was looking for a white man who could sing like a black man, he wasn't being poetic. He was being strategic. He understood the market. He understood that white audiences would never fully embrace a black artist, no matter how revolutionary the music was. But a white kid singing that same music, that could work. That could sell. That could change everything. And it did. When Elvis walked into Sun Studio in 1954 and recorded That's All Right, the song that Arthur Crudup had written and performed years earlier, something shifted. The sound was raw and urgent, and unlike anything white radio had ever played before. And it spread. Fast, because suddenly white teenagers had permission to love the music they'd been hearing in whispers and back rooms and late-night radio shows they weren't supposed to be listening to. Suddenly it was safe, because the face singing it looked like them. Elvis became a sensation, not because he invented anything. He didn't. Not because he was more talented than the men who taught him. He wasn't. But because he was white, and the system had been waiting for someone like him. Someone who could take the sound that Black America had created and make it palatable, marketable, safe for white consumption. And the tragedy, the deep, aching tragedy of it, is that Elvis loved that music. He revered the people he learned from. He said so over and over again, in private and in public. He gave credit. He named names. He told anyone who would listen that he was standing on the shoulders of giants. But the industry didn't care. The media didn't care. White America didn't care. They wanted a king, and they chose him. And the men who built the kingdom, the ones who laid every brick, who wrote every song, who created every rhythm that made Elvis Presley possible, they were left outside the gates, watching, waiting, wondering if anyone would ever remember their names. So what did B.B. King actually say? Because that's the question, isn't it? That's what this entire conversation hinges on, and the answer is both simpler and more profound than most people realize. B.B. King didn't condemn Elvis Presley. He didn't call him a thief. He didn't say Elvis had no talent or that he didn't deserve his success. What B.B. King said in multiple interviews over the course of his life was something far more devastating in its honesty. He said that Elvis was a good man who got caught in a bad system. He said that Elvis loved the music and respected the people who created it. And he said that none of that mattered, because the world was never going to let a black man be Elvis Presley. Let that sit for a moment. Because B.B. King, a man who had every reason to be bitter, who had watched his peers get erased and ignored and buried while a white kid became the biggest star on the planet, chose grace. He chose nuance. He chose to see Elvis as a human being trapped in the same machine that had crushed so many others, just on the other side of the equation. And that grace, that refusal to reduce a complicated situation to a simple villain and victim narrative, is exactly why what B.B. King said matters more now than it did when he first said it. In one interview, B.B. talked about meeting Elvis in the early days, back when they were both just trying to make it in Memphis. He talked about how Elvis would come to the shows on Beale Street, how he'd watch and listen and never act like he was anything other than a student. B.B. remembered him as polite, humble, genuinely in awe of the music and the people making it. And later, when Elvis became famous, when he was selling out arenas and appearing on national television and becoming a name that everyone in the world knew, he didn't forget where he came from. He didn't pretend he invented the sound. He talked about Arthur Crudup and Big Boy Crudup and the gospel singers and the blues musicians who shaped him. He gave credit, at least in the ways he knew how. But here's the part that B.B. King understood, and that so many people missed. Giving credit in an interview doesn't change the structure. It doesn't redistribute the wealth. It doesn't put a black artist's face on the cover of a magazine, or get their song played on white radio, or give them access to the same venues, the same opportunities, the same financial security that Elvis had. Elvis could say all the right things, and he often did. But the industry wasn't built to reward honesty. It was built to reward marketability. And in 1950s America, a black face wasn't marketable to white audiences. It didn't matter how talented you were. It didn't matter how original your sound was. The door was closed, locked, and Elvis, whether he wanted to be or not, was handed the key. B. King also talked about performing with Elvis later in their careers, about sharing stages and backstage conversations and a mutual respect that ran deeper than the public ever saw. He said that Elvis treated him with dignity, that there was never a sense of superiority or condescension, that Elvis understood on some level the impossible position he was in. And B.B. appreciated that. But appreciation doesn't pay the bills. Respect doesn't build generational wealth. And while Elvis became one of the most financially successful entertainers in history, many of the men who taught him, who created the foundation he built his career on, died without royalties, without recognition, without the kind of security that their contributions should have earned them. And that's where the heartbreak lives. Not in Elvis being a bad person, because he wasn't. Not in Elvis being untalented, because that's absurd. The heartbreak lives in the fact that talent and respect and love for the music weren't enough to override a system designed to keep power, wealth, and visibility in white hands. B.B. King knew that. He lived it every single day of his life. And when he talked about Elvis, he wasn't angry. He was telling the truth about how the world worked. And the truth was that the world loved black music as long as it didn't have to love black people. Other artists weren't as gracious. Little Richard said it plainly. He said they took his sound, his style, his energy, and gave it to someone else. Big Mama Thornton, who recorded Hound Dog years before Elvis, watched him turn it into a #1 hit while she remained unknown to mainstream audiences. She didn't get paid, she didn't get famous, she got erased, and she had every right to be furious. But B.B. King took a different path. He saw the system clearly, but he also saw the man. And he refused to collapse the complexity into a simple story of theft, because he understood that the real theft wasn't what Elvis did. It was what the industry did. It was what America did. So why are people only now starting to hear this? Why are fans, decades later, going back and listening to what B.B. King said and realizing it changes everything? Because we're finally in a moment where we're willing to ask harder questions. We're willing to sit with discomfort. We're willing to say that you can love someone's music and still interrogate the conditions that made their success possible. We're willing to admit that Elvis Presley's story is inseparable from the story of racial inequality in America. And we're willing to listen, really listen, to the men and women who were there, who lived it, who created the sound, and who watched the world give someone else the crown. B. King told us the truth. He told us decades ago. We just weren't ready to hear it. But now, finally, we are. Something is shifting in the way we talk about Elvis Presley. Not in the fan clubs or the tribute acts or the annual vigils at Graceland, but in the broader cultural conversation about who gets remembered and how we choose to remember them. And it's happening because younger generations are asking questions that older generations either didn't ask or didn't want to answer. Questions like, why does the story of rock and roll always start with a white face? Why were the black pioneers left out of the textbooks, the documentaries, the Hall of Fame conversations for so long? And why are we only now, 70 years later, starting to correct the record? Part of that shift came in 2022 with the release of Baz Luhrmann's film, simply titled Elvis. And say what you will about the movie's style, its historical liberties, its over-the-top aesthetic, but it did something that most mainstream Elvis narratives have refused to do. It acknowledged the black artists. It showed Beale Street. It showed Sister Rosetta Tharpe and Big Mama Thornton and Arthur Crudup. It didn't shy away from the fact that Elvis learned from them, borrowed from them, built his entire sound on the foundation they created. And for millions of people who walked into that theater thinking they were going to see a straightforward biopic about the king of rock and roll, they walked out with questions. And that's exactly what needed to happen. Because the mythology around Elvis has always been airtight. It's been protected, polished, and carefully managed by an estate, a fan base, and an industry that had every financial and cultural incentive to keep the story simple. Poor boy makes good. Talent rises to the top. The American dream in action. And again, that story is true. But it's incomplete. And incompleteness, when it comes to history, isn't neutral. It's a choice. It's a decision about whose contributions get highlighted and whose get buried. And for decades, the decision was made to center Elvis and sideline the people who made him possible. But the internet changed that. Social media changed that. Access to archives and interviews and recordings that were once locked away in libraries or only available to academics, those are now available to anyone with a phone. And so people started digging. They started watching old footage of B. King talking about Elvis. They started reading interviews with Little Richard and Chuck Berry and Etta James. They started listening to the original versions of songs that Elvis made famous and realizing sometimes for the first time that those songs existed before he ever sang them. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you hear the full story, the incomplete version stops being enough. That doesn't mean we have to stop loving Elvis. It doesn't mean his music loses its power or that his influence on culture disappears. It means we love him with context. We appreciate him with honesty. We stop pretending that talent alone explains his success and start acknowledging the role that race, timing, and systemic inequality played in building his legend. And that's not an attack. That's maturity. That's what it looks like to grow up as a culture and stop needing our heroes to be perfect in order to be meaningful. Elvis himself seemed to understand this, at least on some level. He never claimed to have invented rock and roll. He pointed to the people who came before him. He expressed admiration, even reverence, for the black musicians who shaped him. And in private moments, people who knew him said he carried a kind of guilt about it, a quiet awareness that the world had given him things it would never give to the people he respected most. But awareness doesn't dismantle a system, and one man's humility doesn't undo decades of structural racism in the music industry. Elvis could be a good person and still benefit from a bad system. Both of those things can be true at the same time. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Maybe what B.B. King was trying to tell us all along is that this was never about Elvis the man. It was about the machine, the industry that decided which faces would sell and which wouldn't. The radio stations that refused to play black artists. The record labels that paid black musicians a fraction of what they paid white ones. The audience that was willing to love the music, but not the people who created it. Elvis didn't build that machine. But he rode it all the way to the top. And the people who built the sound, the ones who should have been riding alongside him, were left behind. So what does it mean to honor Elvis today? It means telling the whole story. It means naming Arthur Crudup and Big Mama Thornton and Sister Rosetta Tharpe and B.B. King and all the others who deserve to be in the same sentence as Elvis Presley when we talk about the birth of rock and roll. It means teaching the next generation that music doesn't come from nowhere, that culture is built on contributions from people who often don't get credit, and that if we want to call ourselves fans, we have a responsibility to know the history, not just the highlights. It also means sitting with the uncomfortable truth that some of our favorite stories are more complicated than we were told, that the heroes we grew up with were human, flawed, complicit in systems they didn't create but benefited from anyway. And that's okay. That's what real history looks like. Messy, complicated, full of people trying to survive, trying to make art, trying to navigate a world that was never designed to be fair. B. King said it best, in his own way, across dozens of interviews and quiet conversations that most people never paid attention to. He said Elvis didn't steal the music. The world stole the credit. And maybe, just maybe, it's time we gave it back. If this made you rethink everything you thought you knew about the king, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video. Tag someone who needs to hear it. But awareness doesn't dismantle a system, and one man's humility doesn't undo decades of structural racism in the music industry. Elvis could be a good person and still benefit from a bad system. Both of those things can be true at the same time. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Maybe what B.B. King was trying to tell us all along is that this was never about Elvis the man. It was about the machine, the industry that decided which faces would sell and which wouldn't. The radio stations that refused to play black artists. The record labels that paid black musicians a fraction of what they paid white ones. The audience that was willing to love the music, but not the people who created it. Elvis didn't build that machine. But he rode it all the way to the top. And the people who built the sound, the ones who should have been riding alongside him, were left behind. So what does it mean to honor Elvis today? It means telling the whole story. It means naming Arthur Crudup and Big Mama Thornton and Sister Rosetta Tharpe and B.B. King and all the others who deserve to be in the same sentence as Elvis Presley when we talk about the birth of rock and roll. It means teaching the next generation that music doesn't come from nowhere, that culture is built on contributions from people who often don't get credit, and that if we want to call ourselves fans, we have a responsibility to know the history, not just the highlights. It also means sitting with the uncomfortable truth that some of our favorite stories are more complicated than we were told, that the heroes we grew up with were human, flawed, complicit in systems they didn't create but benefited from anyway. And that's okay. That's what real history looks like. Messy, complicated, full of people trying to survive, trying to make art, trying to navigate a world that was never designed to be fair. B. King said it best, in his own way, across dozens of interviews and quiet conversations that most people never paid attention to. He said Elvis didn't steal the music. The world stole the credit. And maybe, just maybe, it's time we gave it back. If this made you rethink everything you thought you knew about the king, don't keep it to yourself. share this video. Tag someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more untold stories that rewrite music history, subscribe and stay close. We're just getting started.